Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are strapping in for a pretty focused expedition. We're going into what might be the most challenging anatomical landscape in the entire body.
The head and neck.
Exactly. We're plunging right into the big overview from Gray's Anatomy, Chapter 33, and we're going to treat it like a navigator's guide.
It's the only way to approach it.
Our mission today is, well, it's ambitious. This region is just a structural masterpiece.
Yeah.
You have layers of fascia, dense bone, and these incredibly vital neurovascular bundles all packed into a tiny space.
It's crowded in there.
So we're taking the two-dimensional maps and, the detailed measurements from the source material and translating them
Into a three-dimensional mental image.
Exactly. This is all about building spatial awareness without ever needing to look at a diagram.
And that spatial translation, that's really the difference between just knowing anatomy and actually using it in a clinical setting.
Mm-hmm.
This chapter is the absolute cornerstone of clinical safety, of diagnostics, of surgical access.
Mm-hmm.
If you can mentally place a nerve or an artery, you know where it lives in relation to, say, the skull base or a specific vertebra, you just elevate your understanding immediately.
So we're not just listing parts.
No, not at all. We're explaining their crucial relationships and, maybe most importantly, the clinical stakes involved when those relationships go wrong. We'll move systematically from the outside in. Skin and fascia, the skeleton, vasculature, innervation, and then the surface landmarks.
Okay, so let's start at the very top, literally, with the layers of protection. When you touch your own scalp, you notice that superficial fascia is, well, it's firm, it's dense.
Anatomically, it's described as fibroadipose.
Right. It's connective tissue with fat and fibrous strands, and that's why the scalp feels so fixed to the bone. It's tightly tethered to the skin and that deep epicranial aponeurosis.
And that stability is in sharp contrast to the face. Surgeons who work on the face and neck are obsessed with these layers.
Right.
In the face, superficial to the facial nerve, you find the SMAS, the superficial musculoponeurotic system.
The SMAS.
Yeah, and this is a continuous layer that connects your facial muscles to the skin. It's critical because it dictates all your expressions, and it's the target layer for a lot of cosmetic and reconstructive procedures.
So if we move down from the face, the superficial fascia of the neck changes again.
It does. It becomes much looser connective tissue, which allows for movement, and this is the layer that contains the platysma muscle.
That's that sheet muscle you use when you tense your neck or grimace.
Exactly. Now we hit the fortifications.
Yeah.
The deep cervical fascia. This is what really compartmentalizes everything in the neck.
Okay, so this is a big deal.
A very big deal. We divide it into the superficial investing layer, a middle layer, and a deep layer. But the most functionally important structure here is the carotid sheath.
Which is a condensation of all three layers.
Exactly.
And what's bundled up inside this incredibly vital structure.
Okay, so the sheath surrounds four things that absolutely cannot be disrupted. The common and internal carotid arteries, the internal jugular vein, the vagus nerve,
Velodex.
and a small loop of nerves called the ansa cervicalis.
The ansa cervicalis is interesting. It's not part of the main trunk.
No, it's a motor loop that supplies the infrahyoid strap muscles. It's just conveniently tucked into the sheath for the ride.
So this raises the big question. Why does all this compartmentalization matter so much in the neck?
Infection, that's the one-word answer. These fascia layers, while they act as barriers, also define what we call potential tissue spaces.
So paths of least resistance.
Precisely. If an infection breaches one layer, say, from a dental abscess, it follows that path. These layers become literal highways for pathogens, allowing infections to spread rapidly from your jaw, down the neck, and potentially into the mediastinum,
Into the chest cavity.
which can be catastrophic. Understanding the geometry of the fascia is literally understanding the path of disease.
That immediately frames the surrounding bone as a high-stakes framework. So let's transition to the rigid structures. The skull has 28 bones.
Right, and they're categorized into the cranium and the facial skeleton. The cranium itself splits into the calvaria, which is the skull cap,
The top part.
and the basic cranium, the base. This is the brain's protective armor. Below that, the facial skeleton has those pneumatized bones, like the maxillae, which contain the perinatal sinuses.
Which are great for reducing weight, but are also, a prime spot for infections.
Of course. And inside the cranium, it's all about what's being protected. You've got the brain, obviously, wrapped in the meninges, the tough dura, the web-like arachnoid, and the delicate pia mater, all bathed in CSF.
And the dura isn't just a simple wrapper.
Not at all. It forms critical partitions. The falx cerebri separates the two cerebral hemispheres, And the powerful tentorium cerebelli separates the cerebellum below from the occipital lobes above. It literally stops the brain from crushing itself under its own weight.
And the base of the skull organizes everything passing in and out.
Exactly. When you look down inside, you see three distinct areas. The anterior cranial fossa holds the frontal lobes, the middle cranial fossa holds the temporal lobes, and the posterior fossa houses the brainstem and cerebellum. Every single nerve and major artery has to pass through a specific hole, a foramen, in this bony floor.
It's a map of neurovascular vulnerability.
Perfectly put.
Moving down, we hit the 7 cervical vertebrae, the mobile scaffolding for the head.
And they're unique. They have a large vertebral canal for the spinal cord, and they have the foramen transversarium in their transverse processes.
Little holes for the vertebral artery.
Right, for the arteries to pass up towards the brain. You see that in C1 through C6. C7 is usually the outlier.
And we have to remember the atypical ones. C1, the atlas, is a ring that holds the skull.
C2, the axis, has that odontoid process, the dens, that lets you rotate your head.
And C7 is the vertebra prominens, that bump you can feel at the base of your neck.
Don't overlook the floating skeletal elements either. The hyoid bone, that U-shaped bone, is just suspended in the neck by muscles and ligaments. It's usually level with C4.
Its unique position is crucial for swallowing and speech.
It is. And then you have the specialized framework of the larynx. The laryngeal cartilages are what define the voice box. You have the big single ones, the thyroid, the cricoid, the epiglottis.
And then the small paired ones that control the vocal cords.
The arytenoid, cuneiform, corniculate, and tritiate cartilages. They govern the tension and position.
Okay, here's where it gets really, really interesting for me. The vascular supply. The main arterial traffic is handled by the carotid system in the front and the subclavian system on the sides.
This differentiation is, I would argue, the most vital clinical distinction in this whole chapter. The common carotid artery splits. It bifurcates right around the upper border of the thyroid cartilage.
Roughly at the level of the C4 vertebra.
That's right. And this gives us the external and the internal carotid arteries.
The external carotid, the ECA, is the one with that spectacular array of branches.
8 major ones in total. Superior thyroid, lingual, facial, occipital. It supplies all the external structures. The face, the scalp, the tongue.
So what's the functional takeaway for a clinician?
The takeaway is this. The ECA system provides high-flow blood to the entire exterior of the skull and face. If a surgeon sees profuse bleeding from facial trauma, their first thought is a branch of the ECA.
Okay, now contrast that with the internal carotid artery, the ICA.
The ICA is critical because functionally, it's just a high-speed express lane to the brain. And here's the crucial part. It has no branches whatsoever in the neck.
Not at all.
It goes straight up, enters the cranial cavity, and supplies most of the same side's cerebral hemisphere and the eye. This absence of branches is the key surgical differentiator.
So a surgeon can tell them apart because one has branches and the other doesn't.
Exactly. If you need to ligate the ECA for hemorrhage, you find it by looking for its branches. The ICA is the one without them.
And briefly, the subclavian artery.
The subclavian system has 2 major components we have to remember. First, the vertebral arteries, which go up through those transverse processes in the vertebrae.
Right, the foramen transversarium.
Yes. They unite inside the skull to form the basilar artery. That's the vertebrobasilar system, which supplies the posterior brainstem, cerebellum.
And the second component?
The thyrocervical trunk. It handles blood supply to critical structures, like the inferior poles of the thyroid gland.
Okay, let's trace the blood back out through the veins and then touch on a lymph.
Venous drainage is split into superficial and deep systems. The deep drainage is dominated by the internal jugular vein, the IJV. It handles nearly all the blood coming back from the brain and skull.
And the IJV joins the subclavian vein
to form the brachiocephalic vein right behind your clavicle. And it's at this junction where the lymphatic system rejoins the circulation.
The big thoracic duct on the left.
Draining about 3/4 of the body's lymph and the smaller right lymphatic duct on the right.
And that lymphatic drainage is highly organized, which is a huge diagnostic tool. You have 2 horizontal rings of nodes.
Yes, the superficial ring covers the exterior, occipital, preauricular, submandibular, submental nodes. The deep ring inside the pharynx is known as Waldeyer's ring of malt mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue.
The immune system's sentry post for the mouth and throat.
Precisely. And then you have 2 crucial vertical chains running deep alongside the carotid sheath. But the key takeaway is that all lymph, no matter where it starts, eventually funnels into those deep cervical nodes.
Which makes them the final checkpoint for palpation and diagnosis.
Exactly.
Okay, moving on to innervation, the electrical grid. We have the 12 pairs of cranial nerves handling everything from vision and smell to muscle movement.
And we know the vagus nerve, CNAX, is the notable traveler. It's the only one that exits the head and neck to go down into the thorax and abdomen.
Let's focus on the autonomic controls, specifically the parasympathetic system, rest and digest.
These are organized via 4 specific relay points. You can think of them as the autonomic wiring closets of the head.
I like that. So number 1.
First, the ciliary ganglion. It relays oculomotor nerve fibers to the eye, managing accommodation and pupil constriction. Second, the submandibular ganglion relays facial nerve fibers to activate the submandibular and sublingual salivary glands.
Okay.
Third is the pterygopalatine ganglion. This relays fibers to trigger secretion in the nasal and palatine mucosa. And fourth, the otic ganglion, which relays glossopharyngeal nerve fibers to stimulate the parotid salivary gland.
So knowing which nerve goes in and which gland it targets is essential for diagnosing deficits.
Absolutely. For the spinal system, you're dealing with 8 pairs of cervical spinal nerves. The cervical plexus, from C1 to C4, is vital for the skin of the neck and key muscles, including the diaphragm via the phrenic nerve.
And the brachial plexus C5 to T1 is all about the upper limb.
Entirely dedicated to it.
And finally, the sympathetic system, our fight-or-flight response. Where is this critical chain located?
It's in a high-risk area. Behind and medial to the carotid sheath, right on top of the cervical transverse processes. It has 3 main ganglia: superior, middle, and inferior.
And what's fascinating is that the sympathetic system is kind of a guest in the neck.
It is. There is no preganglionic sympathetic output from the cervical spinal cord itself. Those fibers have to come all the way up from the upper thoracic cord to reach these ganglia.
Now we get to the part that really matters for safety: surface anatomy. This is the ultimate test of visualization. We're converting these centimeter-precise measurements into points on a living body.
Let's start with bony landmarks that mark real vulnerability. The pterion.
The temple.
Right. It's the junction where 4 bones meet: frontal, sphenoid, parietal, and temporal. To find it, you imagine a small circle, maybe a centimeter wide, set at about 2.6 centimeters back and 1.3 centimeters up from the frontozygomatic suture.
And right under that small spot
Is the common location of the anterior branch of the middle meningeal artery. Surgical precision here is non-negotiable. A blow to this area, even a small fracture, can tear that artery and lead to a rapid, life-threatening extradural hematoma.
And posteriorly, there's the asterion.
The asterion marks the junction of the occipitomastoid and parietomastoid sutures. It's the surface marker for the underlying transverse sigmoid sinus complex.
So you need to know where it is to avoid catastrophic bleeding from those huge venous sinuses during surgery.
You absolutely do.
For soft tissue, we need to know where the nerves exit the bone, like for anesthesia.
The mental foramen. It's typically between the roots of the mandibular teeth, 4 and 5, about 2.5 centimeters from the midline. The infraorbital foramen lines up vertically with maxillary tooth 5, also about 2.5 centimeters out. You use these landmarks every single day.
Now let's talk about protecting vital structures during surgery, the path of the parotid duct.
The parotid duct runs along the middle half of a line you draw from the lower part of your ear's tragus to the corner of your mouth. You have to stay within about 1.5 centimeters of that line to avoid damaging it.
But the nerve that surgeons really obsess over is the marginal mandibular nerve.
Oh, absolutely. This nerve controls the muscles that pull your lower lip down. When it's posterior to the facial artery, it actually dips down below the mandible by about 1.2 centimeters.
Which means in practice,
It means any incision along the lower jaw has to be made at least 2 fingers' breadth below the mandible to give you a safe margin and prevent paralysis of the lower lip.
moving into the neck, variability is the big challenge. We rely on vertebral levels, but even they shift.
The carotid bifurcation is a textbook C4 location, but it's highly variable. It can be anywhere from C2 to C6. But you can reliably palpate the common carotid against the transverse process of C6.
Josiak's tubercle.
That's the one, a reliable landmark.
And we rely on the cartilages for vertical landmarks when we need rapid access.
Right. The hyoid is C4, the thyroid cartilage is C4, C5. But the most reliable landmark is the inferior border of the cricoid cartilage, which is level with C6 or C7. That little indentation just above the cricoid is the cricothyroid ligament,
The site for an emergency cricothyroidotomy.
the last resort to establish an airway. You cannot afford to be off by even a millimeter there.
Finally, we need to visualize the path of the accessory nerve, CN equi.
It's very vulnerable as it crosses the posterior triangle. It emerges from the back of the sternocleidomastoid muscle, about 6.5 centimeters below the mastoid tip, and enters the trapezius, about 4.5 centimeters above the clavicle,
And surgeons have to plot that course precisely to avoid denervating the trapezius.
which leads to significant shoulder weakness. And of course, the neck is defined by its triangles, the anterior and posterior divisions we use for clinical localization. They're the anatomical addresses for masses or swellings. They turn a vague area of pain into a definable, diagnosable region.
That deep dive took us through an incredible architecture of safety and vulnerability. We walked through the fascial layers that can direct infection, the absolute rule of the internal carotid artery having no neck branches, the 4 parasympathetic ganglia, and the precise measurements needed to avoid injury at sites like the pterion.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, anatomical knowledge really becomes clinical safety when you acknowledge that variability. Understanding the potential 4-centimeter range of the carotid bifurcation, or the frightening proximity, sometimes just 2 or 3 millimeters of the lingual nerve to the third mandibular molar.
That's the essential layer of knowledge.
It's what converts static textbook facts into life-preserving decisions in the operating room.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the overview and surface anatomy of the head and neck.
Provide a concise recap of the key structures and concepts, and a warm thank you from the Last Minute Lecture team.